Is your treasure in a bank account or in your soul? The truth about the rich fool, he had everything the world could offer. But I showed him that accumulating treasures on earth is forgetting that the soul is the only treasure that matters. I stood on a rocky hillside overlooking a sprawling valley, and the air was alive with the hum of the crowd. They were hungry, not just for the loaves I had multiplied, but for the very essence of life I was offering. My words were a living stream, flowing from my heart to theirs, and they drank it in, their faces upturned and expectant. The Galilee sun was a familiar friend, a golden blanket that warmed their tired bodies as I spoke of the kingdom of God. The rhythm of this life was constant, teaching, healing, walking. But in the midst of the multitudes, I often found myself looking at a single person, seeing their unique story. In this crowd there was a man who stood a little taller than the rest, his robe woven from finer cloth, his hands soft, uncalloused. He listened intently, but his eyes held a subtle, anxious glint. He was a man of the land, a farmer, and by all earthly measures he was a great success. His life was a testament to hard work, to careful planning, to the kind of wisdom the world applauds. His fields were vast, his crops abundant. He had built his life on the solid ground of his own labor. He was the kind of man other men wanted to be. He was respected. He was secure. His barns were full and his family lacked for nothing. He was the master of his own destiny, the architect of his own future. He did not cheat or steal. He simply worked and saved. He believed, as many do, that the key to happiness was to acquire, to build, to possess. He had a plan for every season, a contingency for every risk. He was the embodiment of the world's wisdom, and it had blessed him with a life of comfort and prestige. The people around him saw his prosperity and nodded in approval. They saw his full barns and said, "He is blessed by God." They saw his wealth and said, "He has arrived." They admired him, for his life was the very goal they were striving for. They believed that if they worked hard enough, if they planned carefully enough, they too could build a life of security that would insulate them from the pain and uncertainty of the world. And he, in turn, believed in their admiration. It was the food he fed his ego. It was the confirmation that he was on the right path. He had built a life that was not just good, but predictably good. He had eliminated as many variables as possible, and in doing so, he had become a master of his own little kingdom. He saw the poor, the sick, and the needy, and he felt a pang of pity, but he also felt a deep, secret sense of superiority. He had a different rhythm, a different reality. His worries were not about where the next meal would come from, but about managing his great abundance. He had a good life, a solid life, a life built on a foundation that seemed unbreakable. But I, who see the heart of every man, knew that this foundation was built on sand. I knew that his ordinary life, with all its comfort and security, was a beautiful, meticulously crafted house built on a lie. He was an incredibly hardworking man, disciplined and focused, and his efforts were not wasted. The soil of his land was indeed fertile, and his crops responded with a generous yield. His barns were solid, his laborers faithful. He had all the earthly blessings a man could desire, and he saw his life as a steady climb toward a peak of total security and contentment.
He had made his bed and was confident he would sleep in it for many years to come. I watched him,
and my heart was filled with a deep love for him, a love that saw not just his earthly success, but the great, empty chasm in his soul that was being filled with the wrong things. His success was a mirage, a fleeting shadow, but he was convinced it was a mountain. He was living as if this earthly life was the only life that mattered. He was a man who was rich in the eyes of the world, but poor in the sight of God. His ordinary life was a grand symphony of worldly achievement, but it lacked the single most important note, a true, abiding relationship with the Father. He was so busy gathering treasure on earth that he had forgotten to even consider if there was a treasure beyond it. His greatest blessing, the fruit of his labor, was about to become the instrument of his greatest revelation. He was on the verge of a turning point he could never have anticipated, a moment that would shatter his perfect world and reveal a truth that would shake him to his very core. The crack in his carefully constructed world began not with a disaster, but with an overwhelming abundance. His land, which had always been generous, produced a harvest so immense that it surpassed anything he had ever known. His workers brought in the golden grain, the sweet grapes, and the ripe olives, and the news traveled like wildfire. The air was filled with the joyous cries of his laborers, and his own heart swelled with pride. He walked through his fields, a quiet sense of triumph in his soul. This is it, he must have thought. This is the harvest that secures my future. This is the culmination of a lifetime of work. He had planned for a good harvest, but this was a divine overflow, a blessing so immense it felt almost overwhelming. This was the moment he had been working for, the moment when his anxieties would finally be put to rest. But with this great blessing came a problem. His barns, which he had so meticulously built and maintained, were not large enough to hold it all. His mind, so accustomed to solving problems, immediately began to work. "What shall I do?" he said to himself, walking the perimeter of his property. He was talking to himself, not to God. He was not asking for divine guidance. He was seeking a logical solution to a logistical problem. He saw only a challenge to his earthly wisdom, not a call to a spiritual solution. He considered his options, but they were all centered on a single, selfish reality. He could have shared the excess with his community, with the poor, with the widows and orphans. He could have used this incredible blessing to bless others, to lift up those who had nothing. But this thought, if it ever entered his mind, was quickly dismissed. He saw this abundance as his own, a reward for his own hard work, not a gift to be shared. The crack began here, in the chasm between what he had and what he was willing to give. His barns were overflowing, but his heart was a barren, closed field. He made his decision. He would tear down his old barns and build bigger ones. He would build grander, more secure structures, fortresses of grain and wine that would hold not just this year's harvest, but the harvest of many years to come. He was certain that this was the right choice. It was the only choice as far as he was concerned. He was looking at his life through the lens of a scarcity mindset, even in the midst of overwhelming abundance. He had so much, but he was still worried about not having enough. He was still trying to secure a future that was, in reality, never promised to him. He was a master of the visible, but he was completely blind to the invisible. He was building his house on the sands of his own pride, a fortress of material security that was utterly defenseless against the forces of eternity. The crack was widening, and he was completely unaware. He was so busy celebrating his ingenuity and his wealth that he failed to notice the profound spiritual poverty that was growing inside him. He had everything, but he lacked the one thing that mattered: a heart open to God and a spirit willing to share. This was a man at the height of his earthly power, but on the very edge of a spiritual abyss. His decision was made, and his heart was at peace. He looked out over his land, a deep sense of satisfaction in his soul. The harvest was secure. His future was certain. He had overcome his one remaining problem with a decisive, brilliant plan. He began to speak to his soul, as if his soul were a separate entity, a servant he could command. "Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." These words were his breaking point, his great final declaration of independence from a reality he refused to acknowledge. He had created his own heaven on earth, and he believed it was a fortress that could not be breached. He was speaking of a future that was a figment of his imagination, a future built on a single fatal assumption: that he had control over his own life, his own time, his own soul. He had built his world on the foundation of the things he could touch, and he was completely blind to the things that truly mattered. And then I spoke. "You fool," I said. The word was not an insult, but a profound statement of fact. He was a fool because his entire life was based on a delusion. "This very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared?" The words were a lightning bolt in the stillness of his self-congratulation. The plans he had so carefully laid, the years he had promised himself, the security he had worked so hard to build, it all vanished in a single, terrifying instant. The breaking point was the sudden, undeniable confrontation with his own mortality. He had lived his life as if it would go on forever, and in a single moment he realized it was ending. All his worldly treasures, the full barns, the fertile fields, the meticulously laid plans, they were not his. He was not the master of his own destiny. He was merely a steward, and a very bad one at that. His soul, the very treasure he had ignored for so long, was now being demanded of him. The terror in his heart was a storm that raged without sound. The man who had everything now had nothing. The man who had been so certain of his future now had no future at all. His final, desperate act was to speak to his soul, to tell it to be at peace. to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of the world. And in that very moment, his soul was torn from him. He had prepared for a long life, but he had not prepared for death. He had gathered treasures on earth, but he had gathered no treasure in heaven. The breaking point was a total and absolute reversal of his reality. He had lived his life to be rich, but he died a pauper. He had believed in his own strength, but in the end, his strength was nothing. The truth was revealed to him in its most brutal form. A person's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. His perfect, ordinary life had come to a sudden, jarring end, and he was left with nothing but the truth of his own foolishness. The breaking point was not a disaster. It was a revelation, a profound and horrifying shift from an earthly reality to a spiritual one. My words hung in the air, a final, unyielding reality for the man in the parable. I was speaking to him, but the story was meant for everyone who listened, for the crowds who admired him and for the disciples who were still wrestling with their own desires for worldly security. The man's sudden death was the dramatic, painful shift that forced the entire audience to confront a question they had been avoiding their whole lives. The shift was from the visible to the invisible, from the temporary to the eternal, from the possession to the soul. I was holding up a mirror to the crowd, asking them to see themselves in the rich man's story. I was forcing them to consider what they were living for. This parable was a gentle but firm rebuke to their worldly ambitions. They had come to me seeking a kingdom that would give them power, wealth, and earthly security. They believed that when I came into my full glory, they would be rewarded with earthly treasures. But I was teaching them that the only treasure that matters is the one that cannot be taken away. I was teaching them that the soul is the most precious thing in all of creation, and that every decision they make in this life should be in service of its eternal well-being. The shift was from a mindset of accumulation to a mindset of generosity. I was not telling them that wealth was evil. I was telling them that the love of wealth was a deadly poison, a sickness of the soul that could blind a person to the only thing that matters. I looked at the disciples, and I saw a new kind of understanding dawn in their eyes. They had seen me feed the multitudes, and they had believed that the kingdom was about abundance on a grand scale. Now they were beginning to understand that true abundance was not about having enough to satisfy your own desires, but about having a heart so full of love that it overflowed to others. The shift was from what can I gain to what can I give. I was telling them that the only thing that truly lasts is the love you show to others, the kindness you perform, and the treasure you store up in heaven through a life of selfless service. The man in the parable was rich in this world, but in the sight of God he was a beggar. I was teaching them that the true measure of a person's worth is not the size of their barns, but the size of their heart. The shift was complete, a new understanding that would forever change the way they saw their purpose. They were no longer focused on building a kingdom for themselves, but on building a kingdom for the Father, a kingdom where the only true wealth is found in a soul that is rich toward God. The purpose of this parable was not to condemn the rich man, but to save the listeners from his fate. He was a symbol, a powerful warning. The purpose was to shatter the illusion that worldly security is the ultimate goal of life. It was a call to a deeper, more meaningful existence. The man in the parable was not a fool because he was wealthy. He was a fool because he was rich in possessions but poor in spirit. He was rich toward himself, but he was not rich toward God. He had forgotten the great fundamental law of the universe, that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. The purpose was to show them that a life built on material wealth is a life built on a foundation of shifting sand. It is a life that can be swept away in a single, unannounced moment. This was a lesson in priorities. I was teaching them that their first and only priority should be to store up treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. I was showing them that the true measure of their success was not in their bank account or in the size of their house, but in the condition of their soul. The purpose was to teach them a timeless, powerful truth, that you cannot serve both God and money. You must choose. You must decide what kind of treasure you will seek. The parable was an invitation to a life of true freedom, the freedom from the constant, consuming anxiety of accumulating more. It was a call to a life of abundance, not in material things, but in spiritual ones. The purpose was also to show them that a life of generosity is not a choice, but a spiritual necessity. The man in the parable could have used his abundance to bless others, but he chose to hoard it for himself. He chose to be a fool. I was teaching them that the true law of the harvest is not about what you gather, but about what you sow. A heart that is closed to others is a heart that is closed to God. The parable was a profound reminder that we are all stewards of the blessings we receive, and that we will all be called to give an account of how we use them. The man's final question, "Who will own what you have prepared?" was not just a question for him, but for all of us. It was a chilling reminder that everything we have worked for, is a fleeting, temporary gift. The purpose of this parable was to save them from a life of foolishness, to teach them that the only treasure that matters is the treasure of a heart that is truly rich toward God. My words fell silent, but their echo lingered in the air. The crowd was no longer murmuring. A deep contemplative stillness had fallen over them. The parable had done its work. It had shattered their comfortable assumptions, and it had forced them to look at their own lives with a new, sober perspective. The story of the rich fool was not just a story. It was a mirror. It was a mirror that showed them the folly of their own ambitions, the emptiness of their own desires for worldly security. The impact was not immediate shouts of praise or a sudden dramatic confession of faith. The impact was a quiet internal reckoning. They had come to hear about a miracle, but I had given them something far more powerful, a profound spiritual truth that would resonate for a lifetime. The disciples, too, were changed. They had always looked at the rich man with a mixture of envy and respect. Now they saw him for what he truly was, a man who had built a kingdom of dust. The parable had given them a new lens through which to see the world. They were no longer envious of the rich. They were burdened for them. They had come to understand that the greatest poverty is not a lack of possessions, but a lack of a soul that is rich toward God. From that day forward, they would tell this story again and again, not as a judgment against the rich, but as a loving, urgent invitation to everyone, rich and poor alike, to prioritize the only treasure that matters. The impact of this parable is timeless. It echoes through the ages, calling to every person who has ever found their identity in their possessions, their status, or their security. It asks every one of us the single most important question we will ever be asked. What are you living for? It is a question that cannot be ignored. It is a question that demands an answer. The man in the parable had all the treasures of the world, but he died a fool, because he never understood that the greatest wealth is found not in a full barn, but in a soul that is rich toward God. The story is a constant, loving reminder that your life is a gift, and it is in the use of that gift, not in the accumulation of things, that you will find your true and eternal purpose. And I stand here now asking you, what are you doing with the life I have given you? What treasures are you building? And are you prepared to meet me with a soul that is rich toward God? My dear one, listen closely to a truth I once shared. A truth as real for you today as it was then. I told a story of a man who had everything the world could offer. A life of comfort, full barns, and a future he thought was certain. He was the master of his own destiny, or so he believed, meticulously building a life that would last forever. But in his pursuit of earthly treasures, he became blind to the only true treasure that matters. He was so focused on building bigger barns that he forgot the one thing he could never build for himself. I saw his heart, and it was rich in things, but terribly poor in the one thing that truly lasts. I see the same struggle in your heart today, the same quiet pursuit of things that rust and decay. You work, you save, you plan, believing these efforts will guarantee your peace and security. But let me tell you, your life is not found in the abundance of what you possess, but in the purpose you embrace. Your soul, my precious one, is the only true treasure you can take with you beyond this life. Every moment you spend accumulating without giving, you risk losing the very essence of who you are. Don't become so busy building your life that you forget to live for the things that truly matter. If this message resonates within your spirit, and you feel the stirring of a deeper truth, I ask you to join me in this mission to share my truth with the world. Let others know the real meaning of true wealth and purpose. Give this video a like and subscribe to this channel. By sharing this with a friend, you are not just spreading a message, but sowing a seed of eternal value. Let's build a community focused on the treasures of the heart, not of this world. The